Hello, thank you for joining. We'll just be waiting a little bit longer as attendees join us. Thank you for waiting. All right, we're waiting for some more attendees to join us, so we'll start in just a couple minutes here. Okay, thank you everyone for joining us for the 2021 UN South Asia Forum on Business and Human Rights. This is the session titled Taking the Climate Crisis Seriously. My name is Dory, I'm from Q Design, and I will be your technical facilitator today. The chat function is disabled for this session, so if you have any questions for the speakers, please use the Q&A box. Please note that the session today is being recorded. If you have any questions about Zoom or need technical assistance, please feel free to raise your hand or drop a message in the Q&A box. I will now hand over to Surya. Surya, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dory. A very good morning or good afternoon to all the panelists and the attendees for this particular session. My name is Surya Dev. I'm the current Vice Chair of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. It's my great pleasure to moderate this session with a distinguished panel of experts from different countries in South Asia, as well as the Office of the High Commissioner based in Bangkok. So climate change, as all of us would agree, is one of the biggest challenges that we are facing all over the world. It is going to impact each and every human rights, and that is why it is also a big challenge in the field of business and human rights. But are states and businesses taking the climate crisis seriously? And that is where the title is, Taking Climate Crisis Seriously. Are states acting decisively in a cohesive manner? Are businesses doing what they should do to mitigate climate change? So these are the questions that we need to consider and hopefully discuss in a constructive manner going forward. What role UN guiding principles on business and human rights can play? What about SDG 13 agenda? What about the local constitutional and other legislation that may be there in different countries in South Asia? And of course, the implementation of the Paris Agreement. So these are the standards, everything that is there. And I think we need to discuss what is the relevance on paper of those standards, and of course, what is happening in practice in these countries in South Asia. So let me briefly introduce the panelists for this discussion. So we have Mr. Ahmed Rafi Alam, who is an environmental lawyer and a former member of the Pakistan Climate Change Council. So thank you, Rafi, for joining. The second speaker today is going to be Mr. Sridhar Ramamurthy, who is a managing trustee of Environix Trust. Sridhar, thank you for joining. The third speaker is Nishala Arjul, and she's a lawyer and assistant professor at the Kathmandu School of Law. Thank you, Nishala, for joining. And fourth speaker and the final speaker that we have is Romchat, and I'm going to try your last name, Romchat Vachiraratna Kornakul. I don't know if I got it right. And she is a human rights, climate change, and environment focal point, Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, which is normally called as OSCHR, and she is based in Bangkok. So these are the panelists that we have. The format of the discussion is going to be that each of the four panelists will share their comments in response to the broad question that I'm going to pose to them. And then hopefully there'll be some dialogue amongst the panelists, as well as if there are some questions from the attendees. So Rafi, if I can start with you, and if you can share with us what is the current state of play in relation to climate change in Pakistan, what is the government doing in Pakistan about this, both at the federal level, at the provincial level, and what are the companies doing in Pakistan? Are they taking this seriously, or going forward, should they do something differently? So Rafi, you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Surya, and good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Let me begin by introducing a bit about Pakistan and its demographics. We're a very large country with over 200 million people. Unfortunately, nearly a quarter of those people live close to or near the poverty line, with a high degree of illiteracy as well, compounded by security issues that we've faced since the war on terror after 9/11. Pakistan is highly climate vulnerable. And this is not just because we have very many ecosystems, from the Himalayan, Karakoram, Hindu Kush mountain glaciers in the north, to the Indus Delta in the south, and just about everything in between, from wetlands to plains to valleys, all sorts of ecosystems, each individually vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. German Watch often ranks Pakistan as one of the most vulnerable countries with respect to climate change. And while those are technical assessments, my understanding is that Pakistan is vulnerable because it is poor. We don't have resilience, and resilience and vulnerability are essentially linked. Policy-wise, Pakistan looks good on paper. It's one of the few developing countries that has a national climate policy, something that was framed in 2012. It's one of the few developing countries that has a climate statute. The Pakistan Climate Change Act was passed by Parliament in 2017. We also have a very active judiciary, with judgment in 2018 recognizing the constitutional importance of climate justice in our legal systems. And if you ask anyone at the Ministry of Climate Change in Islamabad how things are going, they'll tell you that they are complying with the UNFCCC and with the Paris Agreement in all respects. But that is not the real picture. The policies that were framed, the 2012 policy, is based on science a decade earlier. The Climate Change Authority and the Climate Change Council, envisaged under the legislation of 2017, has never been convened. And thank you, Surya, for mentioning that I was a former member of the Climate Council. It's a 3-year membership, and never once did the council meet. Never once. Meanwhile, the climate crisis is real in Pakistan. Just last year, there was 2 nights of rainfall in Karachi, a once in 100-year phenomenon that wiped out the economic hub of the country for 2 weeks. We've had glacier lake outburst floods in the northern areas as a result of increasing temperatures near the glaciers. Last year, a national emergency was declared on account of a plague of locusts, a locust attack from the Horn of Africa through India, as a matter of fact, as closely linked to climate change as the forest fires in California and in Australia. And we have air pollution. For a country that's not industrialized, to have an average life expectancy drop of at least 2 years on account of air pollution should be sending alarm bells, because most air pollution is also greenhouse gases. The fact is, our policy positions today reflect a technical and scientific understanding of maybe 15 or 20 years ago. And they reflect, in my opinion, the principles of common and differentiated responsibility that were part of the...
We are not hearing you as clearly, Rafi. I don't know if it is only me or everyone.
The UNFCCC framed the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities, which gave developing countries the ability to continue greenhouse gas emissions until they reached a sufficient amount of economic development. For example, under Paris, developing countries don't need to peak greenhouse gas emissions until 2030. And as a result of that little loophole, Pakistan's nationally determined contributions submitted under Paris in 2015 are not our most ambitious targets for greenhouse gas emission reductions. In fact, Pakistan's NDCs envision a 400% increase in greenhouse gas emissions between 2015 and 2030. This is not a responsible position to take, especially when we know that the climate crisis is now severe. The carbon concentrations in the atmosphere are now beyond 410 parts per million, something we haven't seen in millions of years, beyond the stretch of human civilization's experience. This is now everyone's problem. And the truth is, in Pakistan, you can't hide behind common and differentiated responsibilities and say we'll mitigate later. Renewables are cheaper in Pakistan today across the board compared to fossil fuel electricity. And yet Pakistan continues to sign long-term coal agreements, fossil fuel coal energy plant agreements with other countries. Why are we doing this? We cannot hide behind the fact that we are developing countries anymore. The climate crisis is real. The alternatives are cheaper and before us. And it takes political commitment now to be able to say, this is everyone's problem, including our own. And we won't wait for the Global Climate Fund handouts. We'll have to do it on our own. That's the type of responsibility I'd like to see our governments following, rather than hiding behind these loopholes of developing countries within the minutiae of international treaties. I'll stop here, Surya, because there's a little bit more I think I can respond to in the question and answer session.
Thank you, Rafi. That was very useful to set the context for China. What is there on paper, and the contrast that you highlighted between the saying things and doing things, right? And I'm sure this is a theme that is going to emerge from other countries in South Asia. I don't want to preempt what Sridhar and Nishala might say, but my sense is that towards the end, when we finish, all four of you, we might see that there's a common thread that is emerging in South Asia on the issue of climate change. All right, so now let me invite the second speaker. So Sridhar, if we can invite you to talk about the context, similar issues in India. There's a lot of talk by the Indian government, including our Prime Minister, about the leadership on climate change. I recently saw newspaper reports where Prime Minister's office is so-called developing a plan, zero carbon by 2050. It's a leaked document. We don't know whether this is a reality or not. So do you see really that the Indian government is showing leadership when it comes to climate change? Do you see policy coherence amongst different ministries, what they're doing in terms of climate change? And of course, if you want to add something more about what should the government do more in terms of incentives and disincentives to push the needle when it comes to climate crisis. Sudhar, you have the floor now. Thank you.
Thank you, Surya, and thank you, Ahmed, for making my life a little more easy, because the kind of problems you mentioned in Pakistan, the diversity of the landscape, the kind of issues and the recent kind of climate extremes. In fact, last year, we lost 243 lives just for lightning, in Bihar. So, which used to be rare, once in a while occasion where you find someone hit by lightning. But extreme weather events, poor infrastructure has led to this kind of situation. Uh, but looking at Indian government and what Surya mentioned about the Prime Minister's office being very concerned in the leaked document, and not only leaked document in other spaces also, like the International Solar Alliance or other kind of contexts, the Indian government has been talking about climate, expressing its kind of seriousness. But as a person who has been following the government for long, not this government, but all the governments in India, I feel they practice some kind of a cultivated schizophrenia. It's a cultivated schizophrenia, because uh, what uh, what is core to the whole climate issue, how climate change and the development process are very closely interlinked, is never addressed. For instance, the same Prime Minister's office has a list of 1066 projects that it wants to push for, where directly from the Prime Minister's office instructions go to make clearances, or in the name of ease of doing business. And 323 of them are related to coal related infrastructure, and maybe another 200 which are related to oil gas related infrastructure, which in any case are going to be, already we have 40 gigawatts of stranded coal assets, about 8 gigawatts of gas stranded assets, but still our fossil footprint is increasing. Uh, Even with the fact that, like Ahmed mentioned about prices of renewables, yesterday there was a bid for a wind project where at 2 rupees 79 paisa, which is half the kind of prices we pay for coal-based power, was the where the bid went. So this huge fossil fuel footprint, along with talk of seriousness about climate or the NDC, is a good example of how this cultivated schizophrenia operates. Second is that we have several missions which were designed from the previous governments, and but these missions seem to be isolated programs. They don't seem to interrelate to each other. And also, we have a huge problem in India, or even in other parts of South Asia, where different ministries or different subjects are treated differently. So there is, the forest and the indigenous people, or the tribal ministry, whether it is industries ministry, and what happens with, they are constantly at loggerheads. I have had examples where, the secretary of, industry, when he's the same person, when he's secretary of industries, complaining that, we environmentalists stop his work, And when he becomes the environment secretary, he says, these industrialists are spoiling the environment. Why don't you help us? So, this is the kind of situation we are going through. Both for the government and for the business, I think one recommendation I would have is that we should first reject all the false kind of solutions, including the idea of the carbon neutrality or zero carbon, because when we are saying climate change is a global process and is going to impact across globe. So creating any kind of damage to the system anywhere is going to have an implication elsewhere. So we should kind of avoid at the upfront, we should say that these are all false solutions, whether this or the geoengineering and other things that are being talked about. The other thing in India is about the federal state, because between the center and the state government, though there are state climate action plans which are always very feeble and also not very resourced, there is also not very good linkage between what programs happen at the state level and what the central government programs are. So there is a lot of synergy that is required in that kind of situation. The other third thing, for a large country like India, there's a absolute apathy of the rich and the middle class on these issues. They think possessing more cars, showing off is going to be what is demanded. So this apathy, how does one kind of address, is going to be a serious challenge. And also, I see that there is the shrinking space for people to actually talk about. For instance, most of the work that I do is with communities which are affected by mining, and particularly mining of coal and associated industries. And I find that neither the government nor its regulatory mechanisms are strong enough to be able to address these problems. And even when the National Green Tribunal or when the courts give a very good verdict, it's a challenge to actually get it implemented on ground. For instance, after decades of kind of struggle in one of the states in India, the Chhattisgarh in central part of India, which has a huge coal mining and thermal footprint, somewhere close to about $21 million fine was levied by the tribunal because of the kind of pollution caused by the coal mines. But the tribunal has to have a committee to inspect whether people are actually doing anything about it. So it's not only just good policy, but how do we implement those policies? What are the kind of compliance and regulatory systems that are in place? And also, I think it is time for Indian businesses and particularly India-based or India-owned multinational corporations to seriously put a business transition plan in the context of climate change. If coal is needed to be phased out in the next 10, 15 years, what do they do? So I think that kind of a high-level board thinking has to be inculcated in the Indian industry if we need to look at this. And of course, there is a huge and vast improvement that Indian corporates need to do in their human rights behavior, because in India, a lot of activity happens through outsourcing, even in infrastructure industry. So the last mile operator and the policy of the corporate are vastly, like there's a huge chasm between them. I'll stop here, Surya. I'll respond if there are questions.
Yes, thank you very much, Sridhar. That was very good. You kind of provided an overview of where we are in India in terms of both the government and the private sector, and I think you also hinted about what should businesses be doing. I already see a question from the attendees, so I'll invite more people. If you have more questions, please put those questions in, and I'm going to pick up those questions after the first round of interventions from the panelist. So now let me invite to the third panelist, and this panelist is going to reflect, Nishala. She's going to reflect about the state of play on climate change in Nepal. So how climate change is impacting Nepal, Nishala? What kind of discussions you see amongst the government ministries or other stakeholders, including in companies, about climate change? And what steps the government of Nepal or companies, whether these are local companies or foreign investors in Nepal, they're doing? And I think let's focus on this in the first round. I may come back to you with some questions later on, but over to you for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Surya, for your kind introduction and the set of questions that you've posed. My presentation is premised on climate change's interface with agriculture in Nepal, where 70% of farmers are women. Therefore, climate change has a distinct gendered impact here, for it is precipitating an economic crisis against a historically disadvantaged group. And I say this because we need to remember that farmers here do not own land, do not have access to property, and most are informally employed. Therefore, they're outside the protection of labor laws. In light of this, we can anticipate more women to opt for foreign employment. And this is in a country where 1,500 young men and women leave every day for employment purposes abroad. So government records also show that more women opt to migrate through irregular channels to circumvent travel restrictions, and this puts them in a vulnerable position as their chances of exploitation and trafficking increases. Now, in the face of economic crisis induced by climate change, we can anticipate more women opting for such channels. Concurrently, another major concern is climate-induced displacements. And as reflected in two previous presentations, Nepal's diverse landscape and diverse ecosystems is also both an opportunity and a challenge. So climate-induced displacement has already started to take place, where more older people and young children are being impacted. It is estimated that some 150,000 people would be forced to relocate every year. A clear policy guideline in this, which may trigger a source of conflict, local level conflicts, if this is not managed efficiently and on time. Now, let me shift the attention towards the Environmental Protection Act of 2019, which is hailed as a progressive step from the antiquated environment in early 2019. So this act requires new businesses to conduct a scoping or an impact assessment study to understand the impact of their businesses on environment. It also requires them to work with communities to project the potential impact on the community's economic, social, and cultural rights. Another noteworthy feature of this act is that it recognizes women as needing a special adaptive plan to redress the disproportionate impact of climate change on them. And the forthcoming gender and climate change strategy is certainly a progressive step. It recognizes the private sector as key actors in supporting women effectively participate in agriculture, and all of which are community-led women groups, and they have increasing influence in local activities. So the government, through this strategy, has given a formal recognition to them, which allows them now to access critical services, including finance and capacity building tools. and as well as promote their local and indigenous knowledge at the national level. But of course, what is there on paper may not manifest on ground, and this legal structure is in its infancy, so we are yet to see how well will it be implemented. And with regards to companies addressing issues of climate change, unfortunately, big industries and companies do not seem to care too much. They're currently just cherry picking a few activities that are kind of just limited to afforestation and awareness raising programs under their corporate social responsibility. But these aren't enough to address the climate crisis. What I see now is an emergence of young startups and cottage industries, mostly led by women, who are integrating sustainable business practices into their business operations. But to effectuate a wide-scale impact, that is obviously not enough. We need more government-led initiatives and policy shifts, concrete policy shifts to effectuate wide-scale change that really addresses the issue at its core. And the newly federated system of governance is an opportunity here. I see local governments as a key actor for their close proximity to work both with the formal and the informal sector, including farmers. Local governments can leverage their lawmaking powers to introduce human rights due diligence at the local level for businesses that are operating or have operations at the ground. Now, localizing due diligence would give an opportunity to address the unique vulnerabilities that pertain to a particular region, be it through its demographic composition, its ethnicity, its literacy rate, or the terrain that they are in. Similarly, local governments also have the power to settle or mediate disputes, and this sort of provides an insulation to informal workers, including farmers, to access these remedial services in the event of unfair labor practices. But to ensure that such services are used, they first need to be promoted and to the people who would be most benefited from such services. So, and of course, I mean, I will not miss the federal government as it's the key stakeholder to maximize influence. But to first encourage businesses to integrate human rights standards into their practices, the federal government must internalize the UN guiding principles themselves. And I see a severe gap between the commitments that they make at meetings and forums, and then whether or not it cascades down into real actions. It's a big gap, and that needs to change immediately. So yes, I would now like to conclude my presentation, and I'm looking forward to answering any questions that may come from the floor, and I'm sure we'll discuss this further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nishla. And I think there are already 2 questions, and perhaps I can read those questions at this particular stage. But of course, you don't need to answer the panelist at this particular point of time. So before I invite the 4th and the final speaker, I would like to read these 2 questions so that you can prepare when we come back to the questions and discussion round. The first question is from Jyoti Rajpatra, and question is that would be good to learn how do national action plans on business and human rights in India and Pakistan consider climate change related human rights, and what kind of measures are proposed for responsible business practices in this space? That is one question. And the second question is from Krishnendu Mukherjee, that what should South Asian countries be proposing at COP26 in relation to adaptation and mitigation? And as you know, the COP26 is set to take place in November this year. So if you have to recommend anything for the government from South Asia, what will be those recommendations? I think we'll come back to those questions, but I wanted you to prepare what you would like to say in response to these questions. So let me now invite the final speaker. She is Romchat from the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights. So Romchat, if you can share a little bit more what the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights is doing in relation to climate change and human rights, what interlinkages the office sees, what kind of work you have done with the governments or the private sector in the region. And in particular, I would like to know about access to remedy, because the people that are going to be impacted by climate change, the number is going to be so significant. It could be millions, right? Because Nishala was talking about, let us say, farmers in Nepal, or Rafai was talking about the vulnerability because some people are poor, right? Or Sridhar was talking about. So irrespective of the size of the country, the affected people are going to be millions and millions, right? So how do they get access to remedy, and from whom? From companies, from governments, global fund. So wide set of questions for you to reflect, and of course we'll come back to these questions perhaps with all four of you together. But I want you to start reflecting on these big questions to start the discussion. Thank you, Ramchat. The floor is yours.
Sure. Thank you, Sayan and the UNDP team for inviting the OSHR to speak at this forum, because as all of my fellow panelists already mentioned, the climate change is a very serious issue, not only for the South Asia, but around the world. And this is an emerging issue in the human rights as well. In the UN Human Rights Office, we just start having the dedicated staff focusing on the climate change and human rights interlinkage between these two issues. And we just start having this work stream in, I am based in Bangkok, Regional Office for Southeast Asia, but I cover all the Asia region, so that's why I also following the situation in South Asia as well. And what we are, the UN Human Rights Office is focusing is to raise the awareness with the states and government about the human rights obligation in the relation of climate change, because as Nishala just already mentioned about the disproportionate impacts of the climate impact, because not only for some countries, but in terms of the regions, country, and some group of people, especially the people who are already in the vulnerable situation. As we already discussed, South Asia is one of the most vulnerable regions in the world, and 6 out of 8 South Asia countries are the member of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which is the international forum who which represent many of the climate vulnerable people and the countries which has been adversely impacted by the climate change. And the Climate Vulnerable Forum, or CVF, is the leading the negotiation in the climate negotiation, especially in the COP26 as well. And because of this disproportionate impact of the climate change, I will mention only some example of the groups of some individuals that particularly affected by the climate change, and also that maybe the particularly exposed for the climate change impact, including the other persons, small-scale farmers, as Nishala mentioned already, local farmers, persons with disabilities, LGBTQI, the poor, and the ethnic and racial minorities. But I think in the Asia Pacific countries, indigenous people also in the front line of the adverse impact of the climate change, because they have been living in a very fragile ecosystem, and they also directly affected by the environmental degradation, such as deforestation, land degradation, land grabbing, or excessive exploitation of the mineral resources. And women is also affect the impact of climate change in a very unique way compared to to mend because there is some form of systematic discrimination that can lead to the gender differentiate impact of climate change, and also the intersectional forms of discrimination that can further the increase of the vulnerabilities of the subwomen to the climate change, and they, in some particular situation, in case of the displacement or natural disaster, the woman may experience the gender-based violence during that situation as well. Another group I would like to mention is the children and youth, because of their unique metabolism and as well as their physiology and development needs, and because of their body is very sensible for the fragile ecosystem and pollution. So the children and youth nowadays is in the front line of the climate justice, as we have seen all over the world. Another group I would like to mention is the migrants and internally displaced persons, because especially in the South Asia region, in 2018, the World Bank just have released some study, and they project that nearly 40 million climate migrants in Southeast Asia is going to happen. And in that vulnerable situation about cross-border migration or internally displaced within the countries, that is the complexity between the slow onset event and the second onset event. So there's a lot of legal consideration about the climate migration in the today debate. So in conclusion, the paradox of these most vulnerable regions and countries or person or groups who is affected by the climate change, actually they are the one who least emit the least, the proportion of the greenhouse gas, but they affect the most impact of the climate change. And because of this disproportionate impact of climate change, raised a lot of concerns about climate justice and the fairness, equity, and of course access to remedy. Now today, there is a trend about the climate litigation, which is one of our very few tools available for the general public to hold state and business accountable for their omission or their climate action to protect the human rights in the area of climate change, and including for not meeting the target of the Paris Agreement. So individuals or even so civil society organizations are increasingly taking the legal action to state and business enterprise for this kind of action I already mentioned. There is a very recent report from UN Environment Program about climate litigation, and in that finding, this is the second edition already. The first edition is in 2017, and the key finding is that from 2017 there are not only 884 cases brought in 24 countries, but in 2020 the number of cases has nearly doubled of the number in 2017, because now there is at least 1,550 cases filed in 38 countries, and these cases are brought before the domestic courts as well as the regional or international courts, or even the National Human Rights Commission, and including before the human rights treaty bodies. And in the key trends in this report include the ongoing and increasing number of the cases relying on the fundamental human rights that has been currently in the law or even in the national constitution to compel climate action. And while the claims are largely brought against states, the claims against major carbon emitting corporations are also ongoing, and these include a wide variety of the business or corporate entities, such as the fossil fuels companies, financial institutions, and investors as communities and shareholders increasingly seek accountabilities for the role of these entities in the greenhouse gas emission. And the trends of the human rights-based climate litigation has increased because of the recognition of the international agreements, such as the Paris Agreement, in that preamble that said that addressing the climate change, parties of the Paris Agreement need to respect, promote, and consider their respective human rights obligation on human rights, and also the development of tools such as the UN Guiding Principles on business and human rights, which outline the human rights responsibilities of business, and the work of the Human Rights Council and many special rapporteurs, and also the Office of the High Commissioner as well, and the Human Rights Treaty, amongst others, also linking their work about climate change and human rights. So I prepared some Asian case that successfully used the litigation case for about the climate action. That is one case. Maybe our colleague from Pakistan can also jump in if you have more information. In case of about the state's obligation to implement adaptation measure. The case about Ali and the Federation of Pakistan, a 7-year-old girl in Karachi brought a legal action against Pakistan and the Sindh province, challenging the approval of a plan to develop a coal field, and the action remains pending until the July 2020. There are an example about the case again that filed to the National Human Rights Commission, but it happened in Southeast Asia, and this is the case that the Greenpeace Southeast Asia filed a petition to the Commissioner of Human Rights in the Philippines. And in 2019, after the 3 years national inquiry and investigate the major carbon measures, they announced that the major fossil fuel companies have an obligation under domestic human rights law. However, the NHRI don't have their enforcement power. So that is some of the legal barrier against the court against the climate litigation. And the last example is the case that filed to the human rights treaty bodies. In 2019, 16 children around the world from 20 countries, including one little girl from India, 12-year-old girl, filed a petition alleging the countries in G20, and they allege that these countries have violated their rights under the UN Convention on the Right of the Child by making insufficient cuts to greenhouse gas and by failing to use their role in G20 to encourage the world's biggest emitter to curb carbon pollution. So there is some example about the channel for the effective remedy in the climate change issue, but there's still some legal barrier that we have been following.
Yeah, thank you very much, Romchat, for highlighting both aspects in terms of differentiated and disproportionate impact of climate change and different rights holders in society generally, and also highlighting some remedial options and mechanisms that have been tried for so far. So before I have some questions for the panelists, I think it may be good if we can bring all the panelists together, Dori, and we pick up the 2 questions that have been posed. So if you can spotlight all the 4 panelists together, that would be excellent. Thank you so much. That is wonderful. Yes. All right. So thank you everyone once again. So we have 2 questions. One is about the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights. And that is specifically a question for India and Pakistan. So I guess Sridhar and Rafai, both of you may wish to comment. I'm not sure if you are aware of the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights in your respective countries, the process, and are you involved or not? But just for information, Pakistan released the draft last week of the draft National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, and India had released, I think, in late 2018 or early 2019, the zero draft of the National Action Plan. So what role do you see for those national action plans in relation to climate change? So over to you. Rafael, do you want to start first?
Thank you, Surya. Well, like you said, the Ministry of Climate Change just released this report, and I haven't had the benefit of learning from it. But I do want to respond and say that the feeling I get generally, not just in Pakistan, but in other countries, is people and governments and businesses don't understand the severity of the climate crisis. The difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees of warming has been contextualized. It's approximately 150 million deaths. And just to put that into context, that's 4 times the number of people who died in World War I and World War II put together. And we are expected, I mean, there's no chance now of keeping within 1.5, and we're expected to go through 2 degrees by the middle of next decade. And some of the horror stories are 3.5 degrees by the middle of the century. 150 million deaths, mostly in Asian and African cities, mostly on account of air pollution, is the cost of climate change in the very near future, costs that my daughter will have to pay growing up. Beyond 3 degrees, we'll start seeing agriculture fail. We'll start seeing beyond agriculture, the very civilizational systems that hold our society together begin to collapse. I think at this stage, we have to step out of technical jargon, and really this is a civilizational issue. And I want to pose 4 major drivers of climate change that we have to address in the broadest possible ways. I want to try and explain them. It's capitalism, patriarchy, consumerism, and the fossil fuel economy. And I want to explain these before I'm labeled a feminist and a socialist. Capitalism allows the unaccountable exploitation of natural resources. It's an economic system that justifies it. And The Guardian 2 years ago published an article that said that 90 companies are responsible for 65% of historical greenhouse gas emissions. 90 companies. So few people responsible for the destruction of Earth. That is the result of capitalism. And what I suggest, because capitalism is a driver of climate change, is we need an alternative system of economics that provides accountability when you're exploiting natural resources. And the same with patriarchy, which puts men in the middle of this economic system and creates a systemic discrimination against women. We need an alternative to that. And consumerism, this insatiable greed that we have to be able to prove ourselves through a habit of buying things, needs to end. Because remember, again, consumerism is not per capita. It is the richest 10% of the world that consumes over 50% of its resources. And for these people to accuse the population generally of being responsible for climate change is nothing short of racist, because it is blaming the poor and the vulnerable for the consumerism of the minority elite. And we need to address this, along with the fossil fuel economy that flies coffee and ships coffee across thousands of miles so that I can have a morning brew. These habits need to be changed, not just by governments, not just by companies, but by individuals themselves.
Thank you. That's a very powerful message, Rafael. So thank you for highlighting it. And I think what you're asking is fundamental structural changes into how we are conceiving the whole idea of governance. How are we governing our lives and governing countries and nations? So I think that's and I personally, if you ask me, I completely agree with this. But I think that also kind of answers the question posed by Jyotirez. That the national action plans that are being developed either in South Asia, let us say India and Pakistan, or in the world so far, 24 countries have done that so far. I think they are far from fit for this kind of radical transformative changes, because there is no political appetite. There is, I would say, no appetite even in the private sector to talk about this kind of a transformative shift. And I call it, uh, I'm becoming kind of a panelist, but excuse me for 1 second. I mean, I say we need to go back to bikes rather than the battery operated cars, because by creating this idea of battery operated cars, that they are better, and we are ignoring that the batteries need extraction of resources, mining, right? And that is going to impact again so many people. So it's something similar to plastic bags. When plastic bags were introduced, right, they were seen such a good thing to have in societies, right, all over the world. And now we are trying to get rid of these plastic bags. So are we creating battery operated vehicles and everything battery operated in the same way, right? And then the crisis is going to be something else. So I think these are very fundamental questions. Sridhar, over to you. What hopes do you have about the National Action Plan in India changing anything about climate change? The draft mentions climate, uh,
Yeah.
but action I can't say, but it mentions so the word climate appears in the draft of both Pakistan and India in terms of the ministry titles and all that, but not much planning or action as far as I can see. The word climate is there though. Thank you. Over to you, Sridhar.
Yeah. Thank you, Surya, and thank you, Ahmed, once again. I think you nailed it on the head, the kind of transformations that are required. And Surya, like you mentioned, these are all the kind of false solutions that I have been saying. India has been also moving to electric vehicles in a big way. But I see the consequences to communities in the coal-bearing area or other places where land grab is happening in the name of renewable energy. So, large solar parks, then a lot of grazing lands which are treated as wastelands are given away. Many of these solar parks have become a, kind of a major problems for people in those areas. Uh, but looking at the national, action plan and the national guidelines for business and human rights in India, uh, once again, it talks. The Indian government knows how to write well, right? We have people who have good language, and sometimes I say the speciality of Indian bureaucratic writing is its ambiguity, in the sense that it would say that we'll need to increase our business. The common but differentiated responsibilities means historic responsibilities others should now fulfill, and we will mine more or we will expand more. Despite realizing that we are having huge amount of stranded assets. If we look at cement in India, we have more than 200 million tons of cement capacity. And also we have, consequently, we also have the Competition Commission of India saying that there is a huge cartelization in the cement industry that keeps the prices high. So the economic model of capitalism, that with more capacity, the prices will drop down, is not happening. Uh, so we have lost the plot somewhere. Uh, like Nischala mentioned in case of Nepal, the small kind of streaks that one sees is that where younger entrepreneurs are getting more concerned, are trying to create ecologies which for instance create either a diseconomy of scale or shift the activity to more rural area, like the Zoho, which has shifted its whole computer operation to rural areas. So there is the other context that I would like to bring up is we saw during the COVID that there was an enormous loss of work, jobs, and we don't know when we'll take it up and what responsibility the business has in trying to accommodate more and more people to work. But if you see the government's own policy, For instance, government is willing to spend close to about 15 to 20 billion dollars in infrastructure and machinery in the coal sector, and has clearly said in an interview, the coal secretary says that we cannot have so much labor. So we need of transition from the existing economy, transition from existing types of businesses. We need policies that will create diseconomies of scale, so that there are local enterprises are more incentivized, and more nature-based activities are followed, rather than corporatizing animal husbandry, agriculture, forestry, which are areas where huge job creation can happen, and a decentralized energy systems can be developed, along with local integrated livelihood opportunities. So I think the business and human rights, one is between Pakistan and India, not only Pakistan and India. I think in the larger context also, I see we are contiguous in geography, so and our ecosystems. So whether something happens in Thar in India also affects Pakistan. I think also, as countries which share the Himalayas, we need a real good transnational policy and structure for dealing with what is now called as the third pole, because that is going to make a huge difference. How we manage Himalayas is going to impact the huge proportion of population in the subcontinent. As far as as far as the second question, which Krishnendu has asked, I think if I were the person to go and talk, I would. One is the first and foremost, which is being pushed, is this whole set of false solutions. Like whether it is geoengineering, carbon capture and storage. Even in Indian government's plans, there is a huge, equivalent to 47 gigawatts of carbon capture and storage that they expect up to 2040. So one is the IPCC must clearly reject all false solutions, because they are going to create even more human rights violations, because how it is going to impact various cross sections of people is still unknown. The false solutions are also at different levels. They are at the global level, like these kind of ocean engineering, or dealing with the sky. But the more nearby, for instance, we can't eliminate plastics as long as we don't eliminate oil, because after all, plastic is only a kind of a byproduct of what oil we produce or gas we produce. So we will constantly have more and more plastics as long as we have oil. So we need to consider the long-term context, and therefore I would think that there must be the UN must come with a permanent commission which constantly kind of guides into what needs to be done, because if you don't address climate, the SDGs are going to be a failure. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Sridhar, for answering both the questions in one go. And Nishla, perhaps you may also wish to reflect on the Nation Action Plan and all this. But I think I would also like to propose to Dori that we run the poll number 3 now, and let us see if so participants, attendees, you can see the poll question now. So if you can, because one theme that has emerged, or that I would like to discuss, is about the political commitment, the lack of it, and how can we change that, right? And I think that kind of a commitment is needed on the part of both states and businesses. So what are the triggers? What are the incentives and disincentives? I think the question has disappeared from my screen, but I hope you can see it. I think it's back. All right, so attendees, if you can select one of these options in the poll that you see, and we will then invite the panelists to talk about it. But Nishala, I would like to give you the time to reflect on this first, because there was a proposal of a national action plan in Nepal as well. Thank you.
Yes, there was, but I think that proposal has kind of been, we don't see that discourse anymore, or at least it's not out there in public domain. So it means that either that proposal has fizzled out, or people are not really keen on pushing it forward. What we do have is a climate change policy and the forthcoming gender and climate strategy. But while they do recognize private sector as being key in this whole process, these are still soft obligations and these are not hard laws. A national action plan would provide a more authoritative guidance on how businesses should conduct themselves. But in the absence of that, I think it is to a certain extent a big ask from businesses to voluntarily take commitments or additional obligations that puts them at an economic disadvantage. I'm not saying that I condone such behavior. I'm just saying that we need to create structural changes and create policy incentives for businesses to oblige by these commitments. We do not have any hard commitments, hard obligations right now. So, and when the government itself is not showing commitments or is not showing that it's up to make concrete changes, and as Rafi said, is just hiding behind the facade of poverty and the least developed status that we have, we see other entities following suit. So concrete structural changes are warranted in this regard, in my opinion. For some reason, I was not able to give my vote to the poll, but probably because of my internet connection, but I think it's disappeared now.
Panelists cannot, but once we share the result, you can add your vote. You can add your vote. So are you done? I think the result.
Okay.
So this is the result. I mean, we don't have a significant number of attendees, but that is the result that we see. I mean, these are not exhaustive options. I hope all of you can see, but there are three set of options to create, to basically to push the needle, to push the businesses to take climate change seriously. And I think the same issue arises in relation to the governments. And I think that is the question which Dr. Punita has asked, that how can we create this commitment, both at the national level and international level. And I'd like to bring that question as well, but let us focus on businesses for a second. So the kind of transformative changes that we're talking about, how businesses do their business, it seems that at least little more than half, Dori, can we still keep the result? We need to discuss this a little bit. So can you continue to share that? Thank you. So out of a small number of course, but little more than half are talking about stringent regulations and sanctions. The second is financial incentives for transition to green economy. And third is including the greenhouse gas emissions as part of ESG disclosure. So I think it's not either or. Perhaps we may need all these three. We may need much more than that. But I would like to invite now all the panelists, if they have any thoughts, how do we create incentives for the private sector? Because climate change is a crisis which the governments on their own cannot solve. We need the private sector involvement because they are part of the problem. So how could they become part of the solution, right? So I don't know if Ramchat, you have any thoughts on that? Otherwise, I'm going to go back to the panelists in the same order. Do you have something to add on this in terms of incentives and disincentives for businesses, Ramchat? And then I will invite Rafai and Sridhar and Nishala. Thank you.
Thank you, Sriya. Actually, after I start working on this new program for 2 years, I have been invited a lot and speak with the business, even global compact in the country and business association about why the business have to take action on climate change. And even I come from the human rights organization, but I don't think the outward factor, let's say, like the new regulation law or this kind of thing can really change behavior of the business. Because I try when I try to convince business, I also have to tell them why climate change also the business issue, what is the risk, and why eventually it will become it will affect the business. And in terms of the government, actually nowadays we are working and advocate for the green recoveries or the sustainable COVID-19 recoveries. And what we have seen in the region, there's a lot of environmental rollback deregulation in the countries to boost their economies and try to bypass all the economic impact. And when we compare about the public budget that the government put to climate or adaptation or the green recoveries compared to the some industry like oil and gas and fossil fuel companies, it's very contrary to their commitment under the Paris Agreement. And what I have observed also, that still less investment in terms of the climate adaptation. There's a lot of new companies, innovation, or even the woman entrepreneur to try to introduce the new way of business. Or even the green or sustainable economies, but they cannot really access to all that financial resources. So I think this have to be go hand in hand between the incentive and enable environment and new regulation.
Okay, thank you. Now I would like to turn to the three other panelists. And my question is hypothetical. Let us say, Rafai, Sridhar, and Nishala, you become the prime minister of your country hypothetically for a day, right? And I ask you, tell me as a prime minister of your country, whether it's India, Pakistan, or Nepal, you want to do two things to encourage businesses to take climate change seriously. What will be the two things you would like to do? Rafi, can we start with you? Prime Minister of Pakistan, hypothetically, what are the two things you would like to do to change the current business approach to climate change? Thank you.
The messaging has to be radically different. The messaging out of the government now is that climate change is the fault of rich developed countries. Countries like Pakistan haven't done much greenhouse gas emissions, and in any case, were complying with Paris. This does not fit in the face of reality. The UNFCCC, signed in 1992, was meant to stabilize greenhouse gas emissions. It has failed because more greenhouse gases have been produced since 1992 than were produced historically before 1992. There has been no stabilization of greenhouse gas emissions. And I, for one, am of the opinion that if you are in this capitalist business system, using instruments from this system aren't going to free you from it. We need radical transformations. We don't have time for incentives. We have to stop pulling fossil fuels from the ground and burning them for our transport and energy needs. So those would be my two steps. Much different messaging and very strict restrictions on fossil fuel usage.
Very clear. Thank you so much. Sridhar, if you become hypothetically the Prime Minister of India for a day, what are the two things you would like to do to change the current business model?
I think one, very clearly, I'll go with the participants that the Indian industry is, especially the more carbon creating industry, is highly incentivized already. They are going scot-free with a lot of public money. We have non-performing assets which run close to about $100 billion. I think first thing I would do is, because these businesses are only producing money for the industrialist, they are neither creating jobs nor are helpful in redistributing wealth. So I would think that the first this thing would be, how do we seriously look at our company law and company law legislation? Because once we had asked the Rio Tinto CEO as to what does he think is the fundamental problem, and it was very revealing. He said, when government said that you can run a corporation with limited liability, with unlimited profits, that was the fundamental error that was made. So every company knows that its liability is limited, but its profits can soar, which, from Apple to Zenka, everyone is telling us, all corporates are showing us. So I think, which also, kind of reflects on what Rafael said about radical transformation of the nature of this economy. The second I would think is, in the context of India and South Asia particularly, we were a country of huge number of peasants and artisans, right? And across this region in Asia, I would say, but what we have done is, by this mass production, we have killed a lot of our local skills, and also the kind of education imparted puts them away from the traditional knowledge, traditional skills, and does not skill them enough for the kind of life systems that they need in the kind of context that we are having, where one is likely to see climate and pandemics becoming intertwined quite soon. So I would think the two things I would try to do is, one, try and create a serious thinking on a national commission on climate change and development, not just as climate change per se, climate change and development future. The second is to see how we can massively kind of repurpose and also enable the kind of traditional skills that Indian artisans and communities had over centuries.
Thank you, Sridhar. And the same question to Nishala. If you were to be the Prime Minister of your country for a day, what are the two things you would like to propose and do to change the current business model? And then we will move on to this question raised by Dr. Punita in terms of the political will. Yes, thank you.
First and foremost, I would securitize the issue. Climate change is still not taken as an issue of climate crisis. We already are at a stage of crisis, but the kind of messaging, the kind of statements that are issued from the government does not make it seem like it's a crisis. So I would securitize the issue and make it a matter of national security, so that not just business entities, but individuals, ordinary citizens are also aware of how big and how grave the situation is. And secondly, I would make a complete overhaul of the waste management system and require big industries that emit greenhouse gases the most, and throw their waste into rivers and lakes and fill landfills with solid waste. I would institute a law, an ordinance that requires them to have a recycling unit in-house. And And I would make that mandatory across the board, because that is a very, very big issue in Nepal. It has not just affected our farmlands, but it has affected the overall quality of life of every ordinary citizen. So yes, that would be the two things that I would do.
Thank you, Nishala. And so if participants, attendees, if you have any further questions, please feel free to put that in the Q&A. And now, in the meantime, I would like to go to this question posed by Dr. Punita, that do you think political will is a key factor? I think that issue is already answered in a way, because I think both Rafe and Sridhar and others, Nishala, they are highlighting that the political will is key, but it is missing. So if you don't mind, Punita, I'm going to reframe your question to the panelists, that how do we create this political will for the transformation that we're talking about, right? I think Rafe talked about the four things: capitalism, patriarchy, consumerism, and the fossil fuel economy. Sridhar talked about the false solutions which appear to be going to fix the climate crisis, but they may not make any significant. So how do we change this political commitment or lack of it, whether it at the national level or let us say at the regional level in South Asia? Can SAARC do more, something about it collectively? Because SAARC has failed as an institution in my humble view. But can climate change bring all these countries together where they rise above the politics and fix the climate crisis? Because it is interconnected issue for the region and of course for the world. So probably, and we have just about 6-7 minutes left. So if I could start again with Rafe and go to all four of you, but in 1 or 2 minutes each. Thank you.
Well, Surya, if I could answer the problems of the world, I wouldn't be sitting here. I'd be making money somewhere else. It's a very difficult question you asked. How do you generate this political will? I really think people don't understand how severe the crisis is. The crisis is immensely severe. It's not just a technical issue about farming. It's about civilization. It's about governance collapsing. It's about us losing our humanity with one another. These facts need to be brought to people's minds, into their imaginations. These are the stories we need to live with and to breathe every day for this to become the sort of upward surge of awareness that essentially politicians need to answer and respond to things. Unless people demand, and here I think what's very important is a South Asian or a global South discourse on climate change, including climate justice. We need something as powerful as is symbolized in Greta Thunberg and her very strong critique of global North and its capitalism. We need something of our own that puts human beings and their vulnerability at the middle of it and doesn't really focus on things like these big polluters. We need our own discourse.
Thank you. I think that's a good way to look at the future, and I hope those conversations will continue, Rafe. So thank you for your powerful messages. Sridhar, any suggestions you have to build more political commitment in India, in the regional level, in the globally, or in the global South?
Yeah, I think, and we are trying that, here with some of the younger legislators in the states, and some of the people who are in municipalities, to try and understand the massive shift in both politics that is required. Because as you know, in India, in recent times, or probably in many democracies, it's happening that winning polls has become like a T20 cricket match or something like that, where political parties just focus on winning elections, and governance currently seems to be only limited to managing or keeping conflicts within manageable limits. So governance of the kind that we are expecting of people's welfare is neither in the politician's mind nor as an entity in the government. There might be programs which are called welfare programs, but the fundamental thinking about how governance is and how valuable democracy is, a good democracy is something that is going to be crucial. And I only hope that as we are finding small young entrepreneurs thinking seriously, legislators who are coming up, or those who are now entering into the political arena, they need to be kind of exposed. And as my co-panelists have pointed out, that we are sitting on a time bomb. So there is no we don't have space to do this over a long time. So it's a crisis, and how do we handle crisis? Which means a massive community-led movement that is going to be necessary if we need to see real change.
Thank you. Some concrete ideas there. So Nishla, any quick suggestions from your side how to build the political commitment? And I don't know if you want to respond to this question about how do we engage youth more in this, or young entrepreneurs, because you mentioned that the sustainable startups in Nepal. So any quick reflections on that before we wind up? Thank you.
Yes, sure. Thank you. I completely resonate with Sridhar's concluding remarks that we need a big movement at the community level to effectuate change, because there is a critical dearth of political will at the federal level. So I would say, in terms of Nepal, we need to leverage the newly established local governments who have garnered more trust and respect from the general public, and who are in a better position to effectuate change at the local level. So I would actually work with local governments to create that pool of political will. And as for bringing in more young people, more young entrepreneurs into the scene, that is always a welcoming idea. And here again, local governments can play an integral role, because they have the provisions to finance finance entrepreneurial endeavors at the community level. And these entrepreneurs are basically working at sustainable programs, leveraging local skills, traditional skills that we have. So perhaps more budget reallocation to attract more youth to not leave the country and migrate to West Asia, but to stay behind and provide adequate finances and infrastructure required so that they can start and flourish their business.
That's very good. Thank you for these ideas. Romchat, what role do you see for the UN agencies, let us say Office of the High Commissioner, in contributing to building this political will or pushing businesses to take the crisis more seriously? Because everyone is highlighting this. So any role you see very quickly, because we're almost on the dot in terms of time. Thank you.
Doing now is to empower the vulnerable communities. Not we talk about the vulnerabilities of that particular group, but what we have to change is the narrative of their contribution, indigenous people knowledge, the creativities and the energy of the youth, the contribution, the leadership of the women in the climate action. What the OSCE is doing is to try to increase their voice into the climate policies of the national policies and actions, because nowadays a lot of some industry or even politicians have some short-term beneficence or very short-term goals. But if we increase their capacities or the power of these ordinary peoples and have increased that engagement with these national policies, that would be OSCE role nowadays.
Okay, thank you very much with that. And so let me now wrap this up. And I would like to thank all the panelists and all the attendees. We had a number of parallel events, so the number of attendees is not large, but I hope it does not reflect on the seriousness with which we need to take the climate crisis. Thank you for robust discussion and challenging the status quo and the current ideas on the table, how to deal with this crisis. I think that is so those messages, in my view, need to be hammered again and again. And I think we need to involve people. We need to recover the state. We need to recover our rights and our future. And I think that is where the youth and everyone will become quite critical going forward. So thank you, Dory, as well, for facilitating this. A warm thank you to everyone. Let us continue this engagement in different forums. Bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you.
very much.
Bye-bye.
Yeah. And thank you, Dory, for making it all smooth.